You're live.
And we're back. Our next speaker is Margaret Wheeler. In 2006, Margaret became the second woman in the United States to complete her international IFMGA/UIAGM guide certification. She's an instructor of guide training for the American Mountain Guides Association and serves on its technical committee. She's involved in avalanche education through her work as an AIARE Pro instructor and trainer, and she serves as the chair of the AIARE Education Committee and on the board of directors. Thanks for joining us today, Margaret.
Thank you for having me and for having this whole panel and group of speakers. It's been awesome, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the day. I will jump right in with what I hope was a title to capture some interest as well as to capture what I want to focus on today. And that is looking specifically at margins and doing that in our current context, which I'm calling the pandemic-induced fog of fear and desire. So before I jump into the now, I just want to sort of acknowledge where we have come from and where we were in 2019. Cast your minds back. And avalanche education in this pre-COVID world has very much had the focus of understanding weather, snowpack, and terrain. And then that long bullet list there, if it looks busy, if I'm breaking PowerPoint rules, that's on purpose to capture the increased focus on how the humans take this information about weather, snowpack, and terrain and what they do with it on their own and in groups. And so that includes a system-wide approach to risk management. That includes incorporating educational theory, adult learners, cognitive and behavioral sciences, terrain classification systems, linking up researchers with practitioners, checklists, CRM, crew resource management. So I say that to acknowledge how much sort of we're standing on in terms of how we look at these problems. And I'm going to be referring to some pieces from the AIARE risk management framework today. And I'm doing that with the idea that whether you utilize this or not, what I'm talking about today, I hope is an addition to this, specific to COVID-19 and to this winter's context. So this framework was built for lifelong learning, right? This idea that you're learning how to use it in different ways as you progress. It's meant to be a process for risk management in the backcountry for all user types. And yet, so what I have seen in my various contexts, whether that's teaching recreational avalanche courses, whether that's watching what happens around me in the backcountry, whether that's in the guiding profession, the forecasting, teaching those, and then seeing what we do. My overall impression is that it continues to be the situation that what we teach is not what we actually do. And I'm going to go pretty quickly through this stuff. So if this is an interesting list to you, you can Google any of these to follow up. But this sort of joking, not joking quote about our brains are trying to kill us has to do with the way that humans interact with high risk, low probability situations. So whether it's cognitive bias, our own desires for a day like that one last year in the Monashees in the picture there, whether it's our intuitive and our process-based decision-making ways that our brains work, or if you've ever read Taleb, Nassim Taleb about Mediocristan and Extremistan, how we deal with or don't deal with uncertainty. The idea that group dynamics are really crucial to how we implement our decisions. So Colin talked about a lot of these things and some of those great questions we're focusing on that of how do you set and hold rules of engagement for consensus, for veto as a failsafe, for facilitated group decisions that lead to good decisions versus driving the bus off the cliff. So I think you can sort of summarize all of these in this phrase, and I don't know who coined it. I tried to look, but this idea that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and our strategy being our processes, our systems, our knowledge that we're using to make decisions in the backcountry often just sort of get chomped away by the culture of the group we're in or the big picture culture of our communities. So now, Enter COVID-19. And these are screenshots from my phone from the last 2 days. So there is now this kind of barrage of ever-changing, not usually good, stressful information. And most of it's about stuff we can't control at all. Whether it's the behavior, that little red circle there around masks, whether it is what actually happens if you draw the short straw with COVID, or whether it is the big picture. In the mix this year, this has been mentioned a couple times. This is another screenshot from the Sawtooth Avalanche Center, our zone here in Idaho, just highlighting the fact that we saw an uptick when the ski areas closed last year. This year, they're going to be open. Some are limiting, some are not. But if the summer recreation use is any indicator, we're all expecting an increase in backcountry travel. Those folks that are coming in may or may not have avalanche education. So I have those words. Social pressure, anyone? We're just expecting increased folks and increased variety and level of experience in education. COVID has caused this situation, again, just scarcity, scarcity, scarcity. So everyone's season got cut short. Here in Idaho, once everything shut down, we stopped. I kind of lost the desire to backcountry ski. And then gradually it came back, and it was a lot of low angle terrain that we could basically see the car. So our seasons, a lot of us were cut short last year. Just wanted to flag this piece as well as part of the COVID context, which is anyone that's on search and rescue is probably also working as transport for COVID patients because the hospitals are full. Whether the ones near you are or are not, we can't control when that happens. We don't get to forecast it that well. You can sort of see it coming within a couple weeks. Again, locally here, they just postponed elective surgeries. So if you had a bum knee and you were going to get your meniscus fixed so you could ski this year, now you have to wait till after Christmas to do that. So this is also part of our context. The financial strain and uncertainty, these two little things are the snapshot from Sawtooth Mountain Guides when we shut down last May for about a month, 5 or 6 weeks. And then there's a newspaper quote from the economic analysis that the sports retail sector did very well while the restaurants were hurting. So there's a high level of strain, financial strain and uncertainty. These all sort of add up to this idea of distraction, decreased bandwidth. COVID takes extra energy to do all the things that we do, extra mental, emotional capacity just to function. So what I would like to do is to point you towards a section of when you're planning, and I'm using a visual from the AIARE framework because the phrase there in red really jumped out at me as I was preparing this talk. So this is the idea, the plan, the thing you do each day or before each time you go out, whether it's day or night. And a part of it is identifying sources of uncertainty. And that can be with the group or with the conditions, and that helps you sort of judge your plan for the day. So are there other sources of stress or preoccupation that would detract a group member from fully engaging in the decision-making process? My hypothesis, suggestion for consideration, it's not a hypothesis, I don't aim to prove it, is that we might be wrong a little more often this year. Now, pre-COVID, we spend a lot of time in the avalanche education world, whether it's recreational or professional, coming up with actions, specific things that people can do to address the fact that we might be wrong. So I've included that list here for reference because this, what I'm talking about, is an addition to, but it's also rooted in this previous list. So the idea of managing risk system-wide, not just bits and pieces. The idea of applying a system to, if you've read Kahneman, a process that requires effort, that is not just based on intuition. Building and supporting a structure that has a culture of conservatism. Understanding how intuition works, mitigating garbage in and garbage out as we try and build our intuitive decision-making. Keeping consequence at the table, slowing down the process. Colin mentioned the sort of like making sure that everyone is there for the conversation. So those designated breaks as a way to mitigate fatigue, as a way to actually engage the process that you need to. Leading with process, following with a gut check instead of the other way around. Keeping consequence at the table. And I just added this one. It really resonated. Colin mentioned embracing factors that heighten awareness. So really that situational awareness piece, instead of sort of pushing away distractions, embracing that they exist. But for today, what I'd like to talk about is this idea of margins. That's why it's in red. So I always say use margins because we can't leave the humans home. They're always going to come with us, and humans are often the ones who have the brains that are trying to kill us. In fact, I think always. So previous to COVID, we would say this: when uncertainty starts to creep up, reduce your exposure and reduce the consequences if you are wrong. And this idea that you're constantly asking, what if we're wrong? Now I'm actually suggesting this year in particular that we always assume it's the worst case. So what if we're wrong? What is the worst thing that can happen? And then behave accordingly. And my little parenthetical expression down there is like, it sure feels like we're pretty close to the worst case. So why not behave that way? How do we, this is the core question, change our behaviors to adapt to the COVIDs? You know, if watching the news, the behavioral piece of how to prevent the spread of virus is currently one of the major cruxes, right? If you've been involved in implementing changes or creating a risk management plan in an operation, it's one thing to build it. It's another for the humans to adapt their behaviors to implement it. So I would suggest, as this fellow in the picture is you can increase your margins. This is clearly somebody having a great time in powder and low angle terrain. And this was late in the day, so the low angle terrain was maybe less exciting, but you could make it more exciting by adding aerial tricks. However, sometimes I feel that when we say increase in margins, folks don't necessarily translate that into an action. So otherwise said as, what the hell does that even mean? Increase our margins. And how does that help us change our behavior? So I am going to propose the silver lining that if we can adjust our margins, that COVID-19 may actually be an opportunity for growth. You guys may not have heard of AFOG. I've kind of translated it there. But the idea that it's something that we really don't want to do, but when we do it, there's some growth that happens. So what I would like is to talk about how can we shift our culture so that it doesn't eat strategy for breakfast. And this has been a question that I've been asking pre-COVID. And I would propose the idea that if we can actually do the harder thing, have the AFOG, that we might benefit post-COVID from this situation. So let's jump to it. I have two particular topics about how we can do this. And the first one is, I'm calling it a margins list. So make one and stick to it. To explain what I mean by a margins list, I would ask you to consider the grocery store, land of many choices. Have you ever, ask yourself, gone to the grocery store for groceries and not bought any groceries? Most likely you have not, unless you forgot your wallet. So generally, when you go there to get groceries, you get groceries. Now, how you get groceries. When you go with a list, that list can help you to make sure that you get what you need and make sure you don't forget the important stuff, right? Whether you're cooking a specific dish or whether it's part of your meal plan for your family for the week. You also hopefully mitigate your impulse purchases by using a list, but that's a pretty solid maybe. But if you go to the grocery store with a list and a budget, that is a constraint on how much you can or want to spend, this can help you to both focus on getting what you need and also mitigate your impulse purchases and track the impact when you do. So if you have a budget that you blow on sushi, you might not get wine, and that might cause you to make different decisions. So my thought was to provide some ideas about how to use a grocery list and a budget in the backcountry. Two parts. The first is a margins list, and the second is a tour budget. We'll talk about each of those. This disclaimer is yelling at you in big font for a reason, because this is designed to be in addition to your existing planning process. This is an overlay to all of the things that you do in your previous experience, how you plan, how you prepare, plan, ride, and debrief your experience. Side note, if you don't have an extensive planning process, now could be a good time to take or refresh 3-day on snow avalanche course, whether it's a level 1 or a level 2. So what I wanted to offer is a sample margins list. Now this is built and is called a sample with that disclaimer because everyone's margins list is going to be different, but I wanted to give some specifics, and then you can either accept or reject these for yourself. So this is meant to be a list of specific actions that you will take to build margins for yourself this year. Consider this relevant when it's used, as I said, in addition to your existing process, and when the avalanche danger is moderate or considerable. Cast your minds to the graphs about when avalanche accidents and fatalities occur. The little bar graph, the column in low is this big, moderate and considerable, and then high is much bigger. So that's what we're focusing on. This is probably what might make or break the effectiveness of this talk. And that's why the warning is again in big red letters. This list may not be that popular. This is where the AFOG comes in. I say lean in, move towards it, sort of do the thing that you might not necessarily want to do. Take this as an opportunity for growth. Okay, first one, it's already going to be unpopular. Margins in terrain. I'm going to do a series of these and I'll do a couple categories. So margins in terrain, I'll ride terrain less than 30 degrees and I will avoid steep sections. Margins in terrain 2, I won't ride big open slopes. It's a big ask. Looks pretty fun, doesn't it? Number 3, I will avoid hanging out in, that is giving long exposure to obvious avalanche paths. All those little red squiggles in there are just meant to be a quick view of what I mean when I say obvious avalanche paths and runouts. I won't ride in or traverse above gullies or creeks. This is somebody bushwhacking in the Cascades so as to avoid said creek. I won't hang out in runout zones. I won't hang out in gullies. I won't hang out in creek beds. If I have to pass through them, it'll be quick. I will choose ridges over rollovers. So the 2 thicker red lines show ridgeline routes, and then the thin red line is the rollover into a gully feature and into an avalanche path. All right, there's the quick summary. It's a lot of words, but there's 6 of them, 6 unpopular behaviors. There are other factors that contribute, and Colin talked about this with fatigue, and I wanted to include not only time, but also who is there and what they have with them. So margins in time. I'll be back to the trailhead an hour sooner this year. For example, 2 hours before dark instead of 1 hour. I'll do a time calculation for my plan every time, and then add an hour, choose my start time from that. Another unpopular suggestion, get up earlier. So those 2 are focused on time, this idea of planning it and then building in a margin. Now the people factor, again, this comes up, those questions to Colin of what do you do? How do you obtain group agreement when there's disagreement? It has everything to do with who is there. Now I'm starting with I won't ride alone, not just because then you don't have a friend to share their gummies when you ate all yours. And that everybody knows gummies lead to good decision making, right? Yeah, okay, good. The idea that you're not riding alone, so there is one other person to assist you. If you are the type of person who rides alone in the backcountry and has that framework of, oh, I'll just adjust my terrain travel, somebody still has to come and get you if you ride alone. I'll only ride with people who've taken an on-snow avalanche course. And that idea that you have folks who have the education, it's not a fail-safe, of course, but it is a foundation for recent avalanche education, which means people will be exposed to the knowledge as well as to the issues with applying the knowledge. And that can help you really support achieving group consensus and facilitated group process with your crew. I won't ride with people I don't know. See, number 2, the randoms at the trailhead. Maybe filter those out this year. If you don't know them, take an avalanche course with it. And I'll ride in a group of 2 to 3 people. The 2 to 3 is somewhat random, but the idea is that you're not getting into that sort of chaos with 5 people, and you're not riding alone. But you have the resources within your group to rescue yourselves, to take care of yourselves, to help each other out. Okay, next up, margins with gear. So this ties into that idea that our search and rescue and EMS response folks might be very busy with other things, and that we can't predict which month they will. A month ago, if it was winter, things were much more mellow than they are right now with regards to medical workers, search and rescue, and who's available. So the idea is get your own system to get out and then put somebody in it in deep snow and drag them for a while. So you have an understanding of if it works, how well it works, all those things. Figure out, build in, add, practice with a way to communicate. And this can be amongst your team, of course, that question about radios for Colin, but also for somebody that can come and get you, friends or family, but those folks also have the training and the gear and the ability to assist. The idea here, right, is that your party is not going to be a strain on the EMS system in the COVID environment. Do the things that it always says you're supposed to do. Add that puffy jacket if you took it out of your pack because you wanted your pack to be smaller. Put that 3/4 foam pad back in, same reason. So those are the 3 suggestions for margins with gear that I am starting with. I'm sure there are more. Okay, I wanted to add a few bonus ideas, and these are bonus because they're somewhat drastic, but I think they're very interesting to do either as a thought experiment or as a real experiment. If anybody wants to do this season and report back, I think it would be awesome for the post-COVID margins piece of our avalanche education. So consider adding a level to the avalanche hazard. So if the forecast says it's moderate, choose your terrain and your plan like it's considerable. Try that for a winter or a week or a month. See what happens. Adjust your goals. So you usually do 4,000 vertical. That might mean that you don't stop as much, that there's less opportunity for conversation, either while you're going uphill or while you're traveling or while you're stopping. Try for 3,000. Adjust your rate of travel. Maybe you like to punch it. Do that in more controlled terrain and then slow it down, either for increased communication or just sort of slowing down the whole decision-making process. Okay, second part. The tour budget. This is an idea that is not new. So what I'm doing here is connecting COVID to something that already exists, which is using the AIARE scale to organize how you plan your trips. So the idea is that you'll list your specific tours and rides that you're considering this season. Do that now. It's still November, not for much longer. And do that to define the upper boundary, complexity, exposure, and length that are on your list this year, given the COVID osphere. And AIARE is a way that you can do that. So as you're doing this, I'm using the AIARE scale, and I'm also using a summary of it, which is in that plan section of the AIARE risk management framework. And I'm doing that because it is sort of a very concise method or a very concise version of the AIARE scale. So you can dig into the whole thing, or you can start here. So the idea is you apply it to your trip list. Right? Now, what you want to do is you want to plan in general to limit your avalanche exposure. When the danger increases, you want to choose simpler terrain. When the trip conditions are unfamiliar, choose simpler terrain. Assess each slope, apply normal travel precautions. Consider traveling with an expert capable of managing challenging and complex terrain. I'm going to bump back to show that's underneath that plan to limit your avalanche exposure. Here, these are specific actions in how you are looking at your tours. Now, I want to jump into how this actually works. So I'll start with simple, then we'll go to challenging, and then to complex. So the Yates definition that's in that is the summary, is this idea of exposure to low angle, primary forested terrain. Some forest openings can involve runout zones or infrequent avalanches, but there are many options to reduce or eliminate exposure. And that graphic, as part of the field book, provides guidance. Keep it simple, avoid avalanche terrain. If necessary, cross the runout zone one at a time. Okay, so what does all that mean? Here's an example. So I have a photo, and then I have the slope shading on the topo map. So this is a picture showing an example of simple terrain, and these things abound, right? But here's one for you. So you can see exposure to low angle, primary forested. Forest openings may involve the runout of infrequent avalanches, and there are many options to reduce. So this would be a tour that counts as simple terrain. Challenging. Exposure to well-defined avalanche paths, start zones, terrain traps. Options exist to reduce or eliminate exposure with careful route finding. The idea then, the advice that goes with that, limit exposure by avoiding the obvious paths, the steepest slopes, and the trigger zones. Consider entering slopes below the start zones or lower in the track. If in doubt, avoid it. So here's an example of challenging terrain. It's a little bit wonky because the upper right on the topo is the top. It takes a minute for your brain to catch up. But you can see exposure to well-defined avalanche paths, start zones, and terrain traps. You can see there's some rollovers up high. But options exist to reduce or eliminate exposure with careful route finding. So that's an example of a tour that would be challenging terrain. And then complex. Here you have multiple overlapping avalanche paths, large expanses of steep open terrain, multiple avalanche starting zones, and terrain traps below with minimal options to reduce your exposure. So the terrain advice I actually put in different from what is in that graphic, which is for these types, wait till after April, or after April in low avalanche danger, or after a vaccine in low avalanche danger, or next year. So the idea that for these larger complex missions, this might not be the best time to tackle those. So again, you can see this as an example. Exposure to multiple overlapping paths. So you have multiple paths coming down into this one spot. You have the steep terrain with the slope shading, start zones, terrain traps, and minimal options to reduce your exposure. Okay, so there's a little bit of good news. If this graphic is completely overwhelming, there is some really great news, which is a lot of the backcountry touring maps and trip catalogs that are coming out include the AIARE ratings. So you'll have some guidance there. Side note, the exercise of finding a photo and looking at the map to come up with your own AIARE ratings is enormously valuable. So that would be my first ask. If that's unreasonable, given your universe, look for also using these resources. So the idea is to come up with your tour budget. So come up with a list. I've got a little snapshot of the spreadsheet there, whether you're a spreadsheet person or not. It's totally up to you. But having that distinct list of simple, challenging, and complex terrain tours, that's your foundation for your tour budget. The idea is use this list as you consider for this year what's on as an option. Again, can't say it enough. This is in addition to your daily planning process. But use this list to define that upper boundary, complexity, exposure, and length. So for this year, maybe where you stand is that you're kind of like, I'm going to do simple terrain tours all year. And I commend you. That's a great idea. That's what happened to me personally in March after everything shut down. And then 3 weeks later, ski touring season kept going, and they didn't close the trailheads in Idaho. And it became evident that going for a low-angle ski tour with one friend and skinning next to each other 30 feet apart was key for mental health and well-being. So doing that meant just only simple terrain. So if that's what you're comfortable with, try that this year. If you want to get into simple and challenging, then that's a personal decision, and that will have everything to do with the conditions and the group and all of the things that go into your factor. But the idea here with this budget is that you're thinking about this beforehand. This is a prepare for the season situation. So somebody comes along and proposes a tour that's not on your list. You have a couple options. You can then say, no, thank you. Check your list of tours that you're comfortable with and propose alternatives. Or if you don't know the tour, research it. And then add it to your route catalog where it belongs. If the avalanche danger is high, your planning process is what's telling you the best course of action, right? This might be the good day to practice avalanche rescue. Consider an activity far away from avalanches and avalanche terrain, one that takes place in a meadow or a forest, not anywhere near a runout zone, that sort of thing. And if the avalanche danger is low, then your margin list may be largely focused on not physically hurting yourself, breaking a leg, falling into the creek, etc., so that you don't need somebody to come rescue you who should be transporting COVID patients to a hospital that will take them. So I wanted to wrap up reiterating this idea. Are there sources of stress or preoccupation that detract a group member from fully engaging in the decision-making process? And I put this photo in here. If you look down at my feet, you will notice I'm wearing Sorels and ski straps. This is from on a Pro 2 last year when I was so excited about riding a snowmobile up Highway 20 that I forgot my ski boots. So we're already struggling with this preoccupation and distraction thing. And now we have a situation where COVID-19 is going to be continuing to do that. That little box of text is from yesterday. Oregon's going into lockdown. Washington's close behind. All of a sudden, folks who were planning to travel for work in December were all kind of doing the head scratch. So this kind of stuff is going to keep happening. The level of distraction is not going to go away with regards to COVID-19 for the foreseeable future. So let's review. I put these in boxes. I couldn't quite make them look like grocery lists. But here are sample lists. Again, everyone is different. I present this as some ideas, and then you can adopt and adjust if that fits. But that includes terrain, time, people, and gear, and ways that you can add in actions you can take to protect yourself in case you are wrong, in case you are distracted, in case the decision that you make ends up not being good for yourself or your group. The idea of the tour budget. Make a list and then use it to put the upper bound on what you want to expose yourself to, and be deliberate about that. You only have $50 to spend. Don't blow 40 of it on a good bottle of wine, unless that was your plan. Okay, a few words about when and how you might do this. The idea here is that the margins list is part of your daily checklist. So it's something that whether you laminate it and stick it in next to your coffee cup, or whether it just becomes something that's in your field book, whether it's something you print out, stick on the wall, any of those things. But the idea that you're using it daily to remind yourself, okay, today I'm going to ride stuff less than 30 degrees, and I'm going to resist punching it onto that steep rollover. And when we're in those run out zones, we're going to boogie out of there. We're just going to ride through them. Use the tour budget, that idea, to build options now. So that is now when you're preparing for the season, and then refer to it on the daily basis when you're actually doing your planning for specific rides. So that idea, those guidance phrases from how you manage uncertainty and how you manage the situation when the danger increases, the trip or the conditions are unfamiliar, and what you can do about it. Those are in that initial reference graph from the decision-making process. This picture is when it was raging snow outside a yurt, and this is kind of a very clear indicator of things are changing, right? When it's dumping down snow and the whole yurt roof is shaking so hard that nobody's sleeping. But a lot of the times, and especially with COVID-19, we have adapted to the fact that our brains are swimming in higher than usual levels of cortisol, and we can't control the influx of distractions and their effect on our stress levels and our ability to focus. So this talk is meant to be an opportunity to perhaps do more of the things that we say and we teach, but we don't actually do. And that's where I bring in the AFOG, the opportunity for growth. This is meant to be specific to this year, but it is very, very much rooted in what is already built, what is already written, what is already being taught, but we're struggling to implement. So I hope this idea of a budget and a list helps everyone to enjoy the grocery store safely this year.
Thanks, Margaret. That was really, really great. Not only a great perspective, but some amazing tools to put in place for the season. And I think I'll also be thinking twice. I'm definitely one of those sushi and wine shoppers that forgets the eggs. So I think I'll be keeping that in mind as well. We're just about out of time. I do have one question. Actually, we're about a minute over time, but I have one burning question that I'd love to hear your perspective on, and that's recognizing an influx of backcountry travelers this year, and potentially a lot of people who might be traveling in the backcountry for the first time, and then also your suggested people margin point about only traveling with people who have on snow avalanche education. And how do you have any tips for kind of maybe somebody who is in that position of coming into the backcountry for the first time, and maybe the avalanche courses in their area are sold out? And yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, as I was building that that rule, you recognize it's pretty exclusive, right? It's like, well, if you haven't already done it, you can't come with me. And that really cuts the legs off a really important part of how people learn about the backcountry. I think the number one thing is that idea of defaulting to simple terrain and low avalanche danger. So, these tools are really targeted at limiting your exposure and the consequence if you are wrong. So somebody that's new might be more likely to not know what their exposure is and to not know how bad the consequences could be if they are wrong. All broad generalizations. But the very clear answer is that if you have somebody that can't take a course because they're all full, and can't find somebody to travel with that has experience, defaulting to simple terrain and defaulting to traveling when the avalanche danger is low. The other cool thing is that the online resources, this is another COVID silver lining, is that the online resources that are awareness, and they're built, as a foundation for the on snow piece. Those are, the game has been changed. They're amazing. There's so many out there. And so that would also be a suggestion. So simple terrain, low avalanche danger, online awareness.
Great. Thanks so much, Margaret.
Thank you so much for hosting. I'm glad I made it almost under the time limit.
Slightly over.
Slightly over.
Go ahead.
All right, I think we're going to have a quick